to SASA's live book club discussion. Today we are joined by David Laszlo Conhaim. Did I say that right?
Conhaim.
Conhaim. Sorry about that. And we are talking about his book, Memoirs of Spurius, which I have right here. Before we get started, I am going to just briefly discuss who we are at SASA and what we're all about. Let me add this to the stream. Alrighty. Again, we are discussing Memoirs of Spurius, who crushed the cult of Bacchus, Rome, in 186 BCE. Uh-oh, my slideshow froze on me. There we go. All right, so SASA is short for Save Ancient Studies Alliance. Our mission is to promote the scholarship of the ancient world. Hang on, I'm sorry, I'm having technical difficulties. My screen just went black. One second.
Well, I see what is SASA on my screen.
Can you see me?
And I can see you.
Okay, all right. Okay, I'm back. All right, I'm sorry. Okay. Our mission is to promote the study of the ancient world and engagement with our human deeper paths, building a grassroots movement through outreach, collaboration, accessibility, and public scholarship. So we work toward our goal of inspiring a wide, inclusive community of scholars, learners, and students. And my favorite is book clubs, which I think I want to add that to this slide. I'll see about doing that. Alrighty, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. We have a Twitch live stream as well, TikTok, and LinkedIn. Just some etiquette. We do have a Q&A set up on all of our live platforms that we're streaming to right now. So if anybody wants to ask a question in the chat, please feel free to do so. If you have a question for either myself or David about the book or about anything that we talk about here, please feel free to post it in the comments and we will see it. But just be respectful and above all, just have fun. And if you do enjoy what we're doing here, you can become a recurring donor and help out our work here to promote ancient studies by becoming a recurring donor. And that is it. I do have the QR code here for the recurring donor. It is up here in the corner. So if you would like to become a recurring donor, just scan that QR code and that should take you where you need to go. Let me fix my screen here because it is... There we go. Okay, awesome. Now, let's jump straight into book club discussion. So, David, in your own words, can you tell us what Memoirs of Spurius is about?
It's about a nation in transition, an empire that is being formed in the wake of the defeat of Hannibal in the Second Punic War. And the emergence of Eastern influences on Rome and Rome's growing pains in incorporating them, dealing with them, not just the Bacchic cult's influence, and we can get into whose conspiracy it might have been, whether it was the Bacchic conspiracy or whether it was the Senate's conspiracy. But the archaeological evidence is profound in terms of it being an example of the growing pains that Rome was experiencing at that time and would do throughout that century, the 2nd century BCE. So that's broadly what the book is about. It's not just about the Bacchic conspiracy. It's about Spurius Postumius Albinus and his times. And it has never before been treated in book form, either Spurius himself or the Bacchanalians, in fiction or nonfiction, in English or in Italian or perhaps in any language.
Yeah, I noticed that. So I'd never heard of this guy before. And that intrigued me, especially in your author's foreword where you're talking about that this actually happened and this was, you know, real thing. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. Now I want to go do my own research and look this up and learn more about it. So
that's exactly
that's
the way
really awesome.
when I was reading this book about 24 years ago.
What is that?
That's the Penguin Classics, Rome and the Mediterranean.
Okay.
That contains the several chapters, a number of chapters on the Bacchic conspiracy, which in a very eventful year, 186 BC, constitutes most of his reportage. Livy's, I mean.
That's pretty impressive. That's pretty impressive. So is that when you learned about Spurius then, was from reading that book?
Yeah, my autodidactic ancient studies began when a friend, the story is told in the back of the book, lent me Gore Vidal's Julian, which I have right here.
Yeah.
And which I've read several times over the years. It's a delight to return to. We never got ancient Greece and Rome in school. The closest I got to it at USC, University of Southern California, was in theater class. I was a drama major. Initially, I was a drama major. I adjusted my major to humanities with an emphasis on drama to write my first novel. That's another story. But that was it. We learned about ancient Greek and Roman theater, and the rest of my knowledge of the classical world came from film. And so it wasn't until my friend lent me a copy of Julian, recommended his copy of Julian, that I began to get into it. And it was a process that spanned many years. But I went from fiction, from the great historical novels, most of which we all know. Maybe some have been forgotten. For example, John Williams' Augustus, which is tremendous, but people don't seem to remember. To the Roman historians, to Tacitus, Polybius. Well, Polybius was Greek, but he wrote on Rome. To Sallust and many others, Suetonius. And that eventually led to Livy, whose collected works I read in full and took my breath away, as did many of the others. And that's where I discovered this story. It's a gem. It's an unreported until now gem of Roman history.
Yeah, that's how I felt when I was reading your book. I was like, this is so just like thick with complex ideas and people and politics and social life. I loved especially like the first little glimpse that we get of the Bacchanalians with the loud like music and everything coming from the Grove. It really reminded me of one of those. I grew up on British television, and the little tight-knit village communities of people getting on each other's nerves and starting drama. And when I read that chapter of Spurius, like, why are these people over there being loud? It's like 11 o'clock at night. They need to go home. When I read that, it just reminded me of that. And I thought that was fun.
I think we can all relate to that experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that though. It really made me feel like I could identify with Spurius, this guy that lived, you
Mm.
know, over 2000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Um yeah, I liked that a lot. That was really cool. So definitely this is a gem.
And the story is told cinematically by Livy, Titus Livius. Um, you really you feel the times. You
Mm.
feel into history, uh, and you can imagine yourself uh, disturbed one night, um, annoyed by what you described, and and then of course he begins to investigate, or rather, the conspiracy, so called, is brought to his attention, and
Right.
it's true.
Right. Um so in your research, do you feel that the Bacchanalians were as influential and conspiratorial against Rome as Spurius claimed they were? Or do you feel like he kind of used the situation to bolster his own political status um,
Mm-hmm.
during?
I think he may have exaggerated the threat for, out of national interest, not personal interest. He'd already achieved the consulship,
True.
so the only place to go from there back in those days was in an emergency to be elected dictator for 6 months. And the Romans, as you must know, you're probably better versed, given your age and experience than I am, having written this book, so many years ago, and that's another story. I finished it exactly 20 years ago. But Spurius is is he's caught between um, Roman tradition and and uh, an emergency, a possible national emergency that is in his interests to quell or to quash, um, because he's a traditionalist. He's he's concerned about, and this is partly editorializing on my part, about where Rome is going, the
Mm-hmm.
way Rome is transforming, and where it's headed. And he's a conservative patrician, and so it may have been in the real Spurius's purposes to to exaggerate the threat for political means, but in the interests of his country and preserving Roman values.
Yeah. There's a lot of parallels that I drew from Spurius's point of view and just kind of like the generational gap that you see over here in the States. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but it just seems like there's always like, oh, what are the kids doing these days? Why are they doing that? Like that's not, something that is good to do. Hopefully it'll phase out or whatever. And I feel like Spurius kind of exude that um that point of view as like, this cult is corrupting our youth and it's taking over and it's doing these things and um if we let it thrive, it's going to change Rome for the worst. And
It was, if I
I
could just insert, excuse
yeah.
me, it was, I think, justifiably, if it was as grand, uh, even if it wasn't a true conspiracy, but if it was as grand, uh, an occupation, or um, an activity of
Mhm.
the youth, um, then it could well have been a threat to national security, because we're talking about orgies, orgiastic rites,
Yeah.
potentially all over Italy, involving both sexes, whereas the
Mhm.
Dionysiac rituals in Greece were strictly that women were involved in them in Greece, and they were strictly reserved for women.
Mhm.
And it was, of course, and this comes out in the book, cautioned by Euripides in his Bacchae that it could be used, the cult, to actually threaten the state if the sexes were mixed in either in the rites or if women lost their control in the rites, which of course involved large amounts of alcohol.
Yeah. Yeah, that was interesting. It did seem though that most of the people that Spurius encountered were older people. So I thought that was interesting. It was mostly older women who knew about this cult
Mm-hmm.
and what they were about. So I thought that was an interesting kind of contradiction that Spurius encountered because he's afraid of what this is going to do to the youth, and but it was mostly an older generation of women kind of leading this. So I thought that was interesting.
I think that is or was because when the cult emerged from southern Italy, from the Greek colonies, it was more of a traditional observance
Mhm.
of the Bacchic rites, and it was I think it's described in the book and probably in Livy too, as a diversion from the austere times
Mhm.
Romans went through, not to mention the horrific tragedy during the Hannibalic War. So
Mhm.
it became a sanctuary, um, from the tragedy that unfolded over many years. As if we're to believe the ancient sources, hundreds of thousands of Romans perished.
Mhm.
67,000 in a single battle at the Battle of Cannae. It was
Yeah.
9/11.
So going back to the source material, so your primary source was Livy. So who else wrote about this? What other sources are there besides Livy? I'm
Well,
curious.
Livy had, oh, wow, you're asking me. That's a
Is that a
uh,
loaded question?
let me see if I can remember the Roman annalists' names. There was Claudius Quadrigarius, there was Valerius Antias, and I think one other source that Livy consulted. Um, and his uh, notes, his depiction of the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus. This is the bronze plaque on which is scratched the proscription of the Bacchanalians.
Mm-hmm.
May well have been posted throughout marketplaces all over Italy. We have one surviving copy from from southern Italy, which you can view for yourself in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. I can find a picture of it here in the back of the book.
Yeah, there is a picture of it in the book. Were all those sources kind of, yeah.
Yeah. So his what he writes about the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus is pretty much what we can translate from the plaque. So he seems to be quite reliable.
Are all of those sources in alignment on their interpretation of what happened, or does it seem like any of them kind of go
We,
against?
we mostly only have Livy.
Okay.
Otherwise, they're in fragmentary form.
So the memoirs of Spurius, were there actually memoirs, or was this a fictional invention?
That's right. It was a fictional invention.
Okay, okay. It was a good choice. I liked it, but I was like, maybe there actually was a fragment of a scroll or something. I was curious. So did you discover anything that challenged any initial assumptions you had going into this when you started doing research, either about Spurius, the Bacchanalians, or even Hannibal? Because you mentioned Hannibal a lot in this story as well. So did anything challenge any initial assumptions you had?
Well, let's discuss Hannibal first. He was, I mean, okay, he was one of the world's great generals, and he inflicted severe punishment on Rome for 15 years within Italy. The war lasted longer. He was undefeatable in Italy. What I learned about Hannibal is that, you know, when it came to honoring the dead, he was respectful of the Romans, the Romans collecting their dead, and their generals receiving proper burial and so forth. I think, you know, a discovery for me was that didn't end his career. His defeat at Zama in 201 was sort of the beginning of the end for him, but he continued to threaten Rome, and his very existence, the fact that this man responsible, this brilliant commander responsible for so many, if not certainly, if not 100,000 deaths, or 200 or 300, tens of thousand deaths. But the sources are pretty clear that we're talking up to 300,000 Romans perished during the Second Punic War, and he was still out there. He was out there with Antiochus the Great at his court, commanding his navy, and later in Prusias of Bithynia's court, and until he passed. The authorities disagree on, and I follow one narrative on how he passed. He was committed to the destruction of Rome. And that, of course, goes back to his father's defeat in the First Punic War. I think as far as other notions of mine that were dispelled or corrected, is that Rome was a society, a civilization that prized modesty and austerity. Another discovery was that the empire did not begin as we are taught, if we're taught anything, in 31 ACE, AD. With the ascension of Augustus. It began long before. And there's a passage in Spurius, a quotation from Polybius in the mid 2nd century BC that refers to Rome as an empire. So Rome began to become an empire in the wake of the Second Punic War, the Hannibalic War, with its interventions in Greece. That was a discovery for me. Not just that it to protect itself, it had to go to war and had to go on foreign adventures, but that even in that era, in the 2nd century BCE, it was already being referred to as an empire.
That's pretty cool. Why did you choose to write this novel in first person and as a memoir from the main character's perspective instead of something more conventional like third person? Was there a purpose for that?
It's a greater challenge in an historical novel to adopt a voice from the past, to impersonate a person from the past, especially from the distant past. And if you're successful, the rewards are greater too.
I would agree with that. I really liked it from my perspective because it put everything that happened into like one person's point of view. And given, you know, some of the parallels that I feel like with, you know, politics in general and social upheaval and things happening, I felt I appreciated that it was in first person, because it's like this is this one person's perspective, this one person's interpretation of things that are going on. And it left more of me to do my own research and think for myself on the clues that were in the story, and you know what the actual story may have been, versus you know, if you had written it in like third person, then it's kind of like, well, this is just kind of how it was, period. But it's like, nope, this is just how it was for this guy. And I really liked that. I liked that a lot, and it made the history that you presented just more easy to digest for me personally. And I really liked that a lot. I thought that was a really good choice.
And did you appreciate Spurius's digressions? Because his secretary doesn't.
Yeah, that was fun. That was fun.
Well, that's one of the benefits of the first person, that you can digress and touch on points in history that would otherwise be lost to or in a third person narrative. There are limitations too. For example, I mean, Spurius does do his own detecting, but much of the action and some of the more, you know, salacious and violent, or discoveries of violence, are reported to him. So, and you know, he's very much situated in Rome, except on a foray or two, or in a flashback for the entire novel. I should also mention that he gave up the what consuls, Roman consuls, were really there to do, besides governing at Rome, which was to bring back a victory, a foreign victory, or a victory against a threat against the peninsula, and earn a triumph. So his colleague pursued one to catastrophic effect, but with a great defeat against the in an intervention against the Gallic Ligurians, in which I think, if I recall correctly, he lost something like 20,000 men. So it's also important to maybe this was a discovery of mine as well, to point out that Rome, even after Carthage, was under threat. It was under threat from the north. It was under threat from the east. And it was perceived as being under threat from within, with regard to the Bacchanalians. But whether they were actually conspiratorial, or whether the Senate conspired against them, is an open question still.
Yeah. And I liked, so that was another reason why I appreciated the first person point of view, because it felt like a lot of the things that Spurius did were very kind of hearsay, like this person said this or that person said this. And you do mention that you know, after the Bacchus cult is kind of outlawed, those properties are seized of those people, and it seemed like it would be very beneficial to a lot of people. And so in my head I was like, okay, I see where this is going now.
So
So
were the
yeah.
Roman wars. You'll recall that uh, that with tens of thousands of men deployed overseas, and many of these were small holders,
Mhm.
small farmers. Their farms, their holdings went into disuse and
Mhm.
were um, acquired in the interests of rejuvenating them um, by legislation created in their absence.
Mhm.
And that led to the rise of the Gracchus brothers and their demise. So we see, as I mentioned early in our talk, we see the growing pains playing out and Rome transforming and even declining from a moral perspective before our very eyes.
Mhm. Yeah. So, do you have any more ancient Roman projects in mind inspired by any of your research for this novel? Or is this kind of like a one?
Well, it was one and done in 2004, and it was as lost to me as until I sort of rediscovered it, as the story it tells was lost to all of us. And I finally brought it out in the interest of doing so before somebody else did. And it it's a wonder that in all these years, nobody else discovered it in fiction or in book length form nonfiction. That's a preface to answering your question. I did begin and would like to return to another lost story, which in the meantime, I have lost the ability to rediscover because it's been discovered by another writer. But my book is so
Uh-oh.
different, and I haven't read his works. He's published multiple works, and it's wonderful that he's been able to popularize this lost and hopefully refound subject of mine. Um, but my book is so different. It's just a completely different animal about the same subject matter that I don't feel I've lost the opportunity to reintroduce the subject to the world, and that is Quintus Sertorius.
Ah, okay.
And
That was going to be my
he
next
was
question. What are we talking about here?
yes,
Um,
yes.
well, just from my own perspective, there's a lot of emphasis on, I guess, well, mostly mythological retellings at the moment. Which this is not a mythological retelling, but it is kind of along that vein of, ancient historical world building or what have you. So I would say, even if somebody else is writing a story about someone, a historical figure that you took an interest to, I would still encourage you to write it. Just because if someone is interested in that character, they're going to want to scoop up everything they can about that character.
I agree, especially on forgotten or neglected people or subjects, events that need reminding of. But I think what's happened, uh, particularly over the past couple of decades, is that we are being fed and refed the same old stuff
Yeah.
in whether it's Caesar, Cleopatra, Mark Antony, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula. I mean, how as great as Alan Massey's Augustus and Tiberius are, maybe they're so great that we really don't need other novels on those subjects. But since Rex Warner wrote The Young Caesar, I think back in the 50s. I mean, how many novels have come out about Caesar? So some of these great works, and they may be greater than even far superior in terms of both on a scholarly level and also on an entertainment level, in terms of the reader having confidence that he's reading something that has some fealty to the truth. You find it hard to find an Alan Massey book these days, unless it was discovered. So many books have come along since that he's fallen out of the public sphere because he was really good.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, I've experienced that a lot when I learn about a book and I try to go find it and it's, it's out of print, or, there's like rare copies or whatever. And I feel like a lot of that is just because the book market is so saturated now that there's really no shelf space for some of these older works, which is really kind of sad, especially when you don't have, anything following that up to keep that subject matter in the public eye. Yeah, but
which is why I'm so glad that somebody, since I failed to, having abruptly moved on to other topics, a whole other genre, the Western, that somebody has come along to reintroduce Quintus Sertorius, because that story of how he refused to relinquish his governorship of Spain, and with the aid of an alliance of Spanish tribes, fought successfully army after army after army that Sulla sent against him, including Pompey the Great. It's a tremendous story. Maybe it's so broad and so great, and like Hannibal's invasion of Italy, took place over so many years that it's simply too problematic to transfer to the cinema. But it's one of the great stories of the ancient world.
I really hope you write it because I'm intrigued. That does sound pretty awesome.
Thank you. Well, I will keep that in mind, that I've got a fan in MJ, and it's something that I would love to get back to, especially since the reception that Spurius has received has been, a long time coming, and that's partly my fault for not getting the book out earlier, and so so gratefully received.
Well, it's definitely an awesome book. And I loved how you just stuck straight to the story. You built great tension. There's a little mystery element in there. And it's the perfect length. There are so many gigantic books out there now, and it's an emotional drain to read those thick books, but this one, it's a weekend read, and it's so great. I loved it so much. So
well, thank you. The way, by the interview that Stephen Saylor gave you a few years ago, and your purpose in filling the gap left by underfunded or withdrawn classical studies departments, it's more than a public service. It's a service for the future. It's for the future of knowledge, and the various programs that you have to excite and influence and entertain young people with these great stories from the classical world is of tremendous value.
Thank you. I definitely agree. Ancient studies has been an obsession of mine since I read the Iliad in high school. And unfortunately, it's really kind of getting hit hard in recent years from, budget cuts on universities and things like that. And it seems like ancient studies is one of the first things that people consider chopping, which is sad to me because there's so much to be learned. There's so many things that, history does repeat itself. And there are just so many things to be learned from the past, especially from the ancient past, that are still relevant to us today. Case in point, you know. So, yeah, I am so happy to be part of this organization and this mission. And thank you so much for your support, for coming on and talking about your book. It has been an absolute pleasure. It looks like I just see a little bubble in the chat. Let's see if we have a question here. No question. Okay. That was a bubble for something else. But yeah, thank you so much. This has really been awesome.
Thank you. It was, as I said, a great honor and a privilege and a pleasure.
Awesome.
Thank you for reading the book, and I appreciate our pre-interview conversation, and I wish you well.
Thank you so much.
Really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope it's not our last.
Absolutely, definitely not. And for everybody who is watching the live stream, Memoirs of Spurius is available on our bookshop.org page. If you purchase it from this link, some of the proceeds do go to support SASA. I don't know how bookshop.org does it, but somehow their prices are always cheaper than everyone else's, and they still manage to support independent bookstores and nonprofits like us. So definitely check out this book. It is very interesting. It will definitely get you interested in ancient Rome. So check it out on our website. There are some other awesome book selections in our bookshop as well from previous book clubs. So yeah, thank you once again, David. It's been a pleasure.